All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be discussing Perl and going through some demo and, of course, answering your Q&A and hopefully teaching you everything or nearly everything you need to know. So I know some people are still jumping into Crowdcast, joining us on the webinar at the moment. See lots of people saying hi in chat, which is awesome. People from, there's countries all over the place in chat right now. Colombia, India, Sweden, Canada, US. There's a bunch of others. It's so long, I don't even see most of them anymore. So thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate it. And of course, as we go through today's webinar, please put your questions into chat as we come across different subjects. I may not get to them right away. We may save some of them for the end and answer them at that point. But definitely make sure you throw your questions about Perl and how to use it or any of the things I touch on as we go through. So like I say, people are still joining here, so I'm just going to give it another few seconds before we get going. Just to give you an idea of how we're going to start this off, I am going to start with a little bit of a slide presentation talking about and comparing the different Perl models, and then we'll dive into some actual user interface and look at specific settings and how we would set up and operate a Perl. I don't physically have one in here, and if you can't tell, I am sitting in engineering where I normally have Perls, but I don't at the moment. And anyway, a few other people saying hi. So yeah, people from Portugal, that's great. Philippines, this is amazing. Costa Rica, this is amazing. This is amazing. All right. Okay, so we have a good number of people, so I'm going to get started with the slide presentation. So again, as we go through, please throw your questions in there. Our chat moderators will make sure that they get promoted to questions, and I can look at those as we go along. So welcome to a Perl demo. This is something that we do fairly regularly with our partners and our customers to talk about Perls. Usually we're fine-tuning these to the specific needs and the specific use case and workflow of individual customers. Of course, for this one, with 75 different people on this webinar, we can't cover 75 different use cases because everyone is going to have something slightly different. So this will be somewhat generic, but I think there will be something here for everyone. And definitely ask your questions so that we can try and address those. So just to kick it off, the first thing we want to look at is what is a Perl. The idea with the Perl, whether it's the Perl Mini or the Perl 2, is to have a all-in-one standalone hardware encoder for live streaming and recording. What this means is that we can take in multiple video inputs, multiple audio inputs, create custom layouts for mixing and switching, and then live stream and record simultaneously. Choosing between the different models really depends on what your particular needs might be, how many video or audio inputs you need, and maybe how many different streaming or recording encoders you need simultaneously. Like I said, generally the concept is the same regardless of the model: inputs, record, stream. If we look at Perl 2 as an example, it's going to be the biggest option. So it's going to have up to 6 inputs. It's going to have options for streaming, recording in up to 4K. You can create as many as 6 individual encoders at the same time. We call them channels, but they're encoders. So this is going to be for someone who needs a lot of maybe ISO recording or a lot of simultaneous inputs, and being able to handle all of that on one device. There are a few other differences as well that we'll touch on. The other advantage of the Perl 2 is that it does come in rack mount versions. So there's 3 physical variants of the Perl 2. The specs of them are all the same. There's the portable version, and then the 2 rack mount variants. The number of inputs is the same. The number of power, the power and how much we can stream and record is the same. The rack mount twin is the only one that's slightly different, and that's because it's basically just 2 separate individual Perl 2 units in one chassis. So they operate independently of each other. They have separate power supplies, separate inputs, separate hard drives, separate everything. It's really about saving space in your rack. These are 2U racks. And so if you imagine you only have 2U of space, but you need multiple units, the twin is going to be a great space saver, especially for those people who might use it in a mobile rack for live events on the road. As I mentioned, the Perl 2 does have the capability of up to 4K. That is an additional add-on feature. The base version of Perl is not 4K enabled, but when we add this at an additional cost, we get 4K inputs, 4K streaming and recording options, 4K HDMI outputs, and things like that. So there's some advantages here for people who need 4K. Not everyone needs 4K, especially for streaming since it's such a high bandwidth requirement. However, if you buy a Perl 2 and then you don't need 4K today, but you need it 6 months from now, you can actually add the 4K add-on package to a Perl 2 after the fact. So gives you the advantage of maybe buying the base version now, but if you find that you need 4K for your workflow, you can upgrade that later if you need to. But ultimately, the main thing that we look at when we're talking to customers about how do we choose the right Perl model for someone's needs really breaks down to two categories: Perl Mini and Perl 2. And comparing the differences of them side by side, Perl Mini does not support up to 4K. There's no option there. It does full HD, 1920 by 1080 or 1920 by 1200 if you're a 1610 person. It has less inputs, but it's smaller. It's less expensive, but it has a few differences there. Perl 2 up to 4K has 6 inputs for HDMI, 2 SDI, options for USB, where the Perl Mini is 2 HDMI, 1 SDI, options for USB. So half the number of inputs. Audio is slightly different as well, where we have XLR TRS combo jacks on the Perl Mini, 2 of them. We have 3.5 millimeter inputs, RCA inputs, whereas on the Perl 2, we have 2 XLR stereo pairs. So it's actually 4 XLR jacks and then some RCA as well. Encoded programs, which is essentially a system performance level, is also substantially different between the two. The Perl Mini generally is recommended when we're doing mixing and switching to have up to 2 simultaneous encoding channels. So one of these could be recording, one of them could be live streaming, or they could be doing different things, different content, different bit rates, different encodes, different destinations. The Perl 2, being much larger, more powerful, can do as many as 6 simultaneous encoded program channels in full HD. So again, this could be someone doing, 3 or 4 or 5 different ISO recordings and a mixed and switched program feed. So again, the choice between the two sometimes is a question of how many inputs do you need and how many outputs do you need. Some of the other options on the 2 models are going to be a little bit different as well when it comes to supporting network-based streams, essentially video sources over the network. Perl Mini can support RTSP streams, so this would be your IP cameras or security cameras. It does not support NDI. Perl 2 does support RTSP and NDI, so it can do NDI, NDI-HX. It's a little more powerful, so it has that option. Another difference from a production aspect is chroma keying. Funny enough, I'm doing chroma keying right now where I'm sitting in my home office to bring you into my engineering space. But Perl Mini does not support chroma keying. Perl 2 does. And again, this is mostly a system performance thing where Perl Mini is a lighter weight system. It doesn't have quite as powerful of a CPU in order to support chroma keying, which is very CPU intensive. Perl 2, it's a much more powerful machine, has that as an option. So I did see a couple of questions come in, and I will answer those very quickly right now because they're quick and easy ones to answer. The first one is, can we access Perls remotely? Yes, you can. And in fact, that's exactly what I'm going to be doing in a moment when I'm done with the slides and we look at the Perl UI. I will actually be accessing from my home, accessing a Perl remotely that's in our office. So you'll see how that's done, and we can touch on how we do that a little later. The other question was specifically about NDI, which I was just talking about, and that was, will Perl Mini support NDI in the future? It might. We hope so, but we can't say for sure at the moment. It's something that we have been investigating. We've even been working with NewTek, the creators of NDI, to see if there's some optimizations that can happen to make that happen. Don't know right now. There's no timeline for that. There's too many unknowns, but certainly something we would like to do, but we can't promise it. So those are great questions. Please keep them going. One of the other substantial differences between Perl Mini and Perl 2 is about storage. And storage is very important because that's where Perls record all of those files to. Perl Mini uses a removable SD card. It means it doesn't come with any storage built in. So for recording, you do need to add that SD card. The SD card can, basically be any size you want, obviously considering how much time you need to record. But we do recommend that it is a fast card, class 10, U3 class card at minimum, in order to keep up with the write speeds of writing potentially multiple full HD high bitrate files at the same time. Perl 2, because of its capabilities, it has a built-in 500 gig SSD that is specifically chosen to make sure that it keeps up with all of the data that Perl 2 could potentially be writing. And again, Perl could be recording 6 simultaneous full HD high bitrate files at the same time, potentially. So we need to make sure that that storage is reliable and will hold up to that kind of load. Let's see here. So looking at Perl Mini a little bit closer, it has that removable storage, as we just mentioned. It has the touch screen on the front of it. It's larger than the touch screen on the Perl 2, which makes it really an excellent tool for putting in front of less experienced users who maybe it's on a podium or just on a desk and the person needs to run their own show. And certainly today, given the global conditions, that's happening more and more, where people don't necessarily have the support of a full studio and full infrastructure. They might be doing a lot of this by themselves. So the larger touchscreen gives us confidence monitoring, start-stop control, switching control, and a number of other functions right there on that touchscreen. There's also a headphone jack built into the front of Perl Mini that you can use to monitor the audio if you need to, but there's also visual meters on that screen. So you also get these big bright LEDs on the front that'll show you when streaming and recording is running, so that you can even see that from almost across the room if you needed to. On the back side of Perl Mini, as we mentioned in that kind of side-by-side comparison, it has 3 inputs for HDMI SDI, so 2 HDMI, 1 SDI. It does have options for USB inputs as well, as long as those devices are UVC compliant. So these are your plug-and-play driverless devices like webcams. It also does have an HDMI output. This HDMI output can be assigned to have multiple jobs. It could be a larger confidence monitoring where all of our mixing and switching is displayed. It could be more like a pass-through of one of our inputs, or it could even be a local console so that you don't have to use the web browser-based UI to control a lot of the admin functions by connecting a mouse, keyboard, and a monitor and enabling local console. You can get the full administrator interface directly from the box if you want to. From an audio perspective, as I mentioned again, we have the TRS XLR combo jacks, and these are a very special way of Perl Mini supporting these. These can be mic level or line level, and they can also enable phantom power. This gives us a lot of flexibility with the XLR TRS in the sense that we could plug a microphone directly into it, or we could plug in the main out from our larger mixer. We could have them as a balanced stereo pair, or we could separate them into 2 separate mono inputs, so even 2 microphones. These microphones, if they require phantom power, we can enable that and power them. So there's a ton of flexibility in those. And that actually gives Pearl Mini a lot of advantages in its portability. It's a fairly small device. That ability meaning we don't have to have a larger mixer, audio amplifier necessarily is great. In addition, we also have the 3.5 millimeter mic level input. So this could be straight out of a wireless lav pack or something like that. And also the RCA for a consumer line level, maybe out of a laptop or something like that, just with the correct cables. We could be using all of this audio and embedded HDMI and SDI audio all at the same time if we really wanted to. So there's a ton of flexibility from an audio perspective. As I mentioned, the storage, we do recommend the Class 10 and the U3 class storage. Um, Minimum size, mathematically, we often recommend to people who need to record for 6, 8 hours a day would be about 64 gig. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. If you need to record many days without offloading content, you may want to consider something larger like 256 or 512 gig cards. But there's some options there. This is not an official endorsement, but from our own internal testing and qualification, we found that for consistency of write speed, easy availability, and longevity of lifespan, that the SanDisk Extreme and Extreme Pro cards are very good on all of those measures. So you definitely can't go wrong with those, but there are a ton of other options out there as well that are very equivalent. So definitely use what you have available, but if you base your spec off of these two, that'll give you a good baseline measurement. So I'm going to look at Perl 2 here in a second, but I'm going to look and just see what questions we have coming up here. What do we need for good performance for the control of the Perl? So the question there, do we need anything important or performance oriented to control the Perl? No. The control is just done using a web browser. Anything that has a web browser can run a web browser, can control a Perl. So all the work itself, in terms of encoding, streaming, recording, it's all being done on the Perl. So you could use your smartphone or your iPad or a Chromebook to control it. It really doesn't matter because you're just doing it in a web browser. Question here is from university, or I guess from Ukraine, sorry. Which Perl equipment are you using for today's streaming? We're using a Perl 2. For those of you who have not joined us on any of the previous webinars, basically, because we're all working remotely currently, we're actually feeding a Zoom meeting into a Perl. Perl's doing the streaming out to Crowdcast and other things. So we're using a Perl 2 for the actual streaming today. And my producer has put up a shot of our very empty, very lonely studio where no one is, but all the equipment is that's doing the actual work today. All right. I'm going to get to some of these other questions here just in a little bit. I want to keep moving here on some of our slides. So Perl 2, honestly, on the backside looks very similar to what we just saw on the Perl Mini, except it has basically twice as many inputs, HDMI and SDI. So there's 4 HDMI inputs, 2 SDI inputs, still have options for USB, for webcams, things like that. Obviously, there's NDI and RTSP options over the network. So we're just dealing with more. The concept's very similar, but we're dealing with more. Audio-wise, we also have the embedded HDMI and SDI, but we also have the XLR jacks. These are not combo jacks like on the Mini, and these are only line level. They are not microphone level inputs. So it needs to have a preamp or a mixer or something like that in front of it to bring in a line level signal. Typically that's Pro line level plus 4 dBu. And these can be used as either 2 separate stereo pairs or split into 4 independent mono inputs. Even in mono mode, they're still line level and they do not provide phantom power. Typically with a Perl 2, it's a larger machine. There's usually a larger infrastructure involved. So we're already using a mixer or a preamp in front of it anyways. But that's just one thing to keep in mind. On both Perl models, one of the big advantages they have is the ability to essentially multitask. Now, Perl 2 can do much more of this multitasking than Perl Mini can, but again, the overall concept is fairly similar. We can take multiple video and audio inputs. We can add some graphic elements like backgrounds or overlays, and then we can create multiple encoding channels. One of them could be a mixed and switched program feed that we're live streaming and recording, and other ones could be ISO recordings of our inputs by themselves. This slide outlines a very common scenario we see with Perl 2, where we might see 3 or 4 video inputs, and we might create as many as 4 or 5 different encoding channels for streaming and recording. The first one being mixed and switched stream, the other ones being ISO recordings of each input by themselves. Perl 2 can be doing all of this at the exact same time, as like we mentioned earlier, as many as up to 6 of these encoding channels at the same time. So this gives us a lot of flexibility. Now, it doesn't have to be ISO and program mix. It could be any variation you want. Many customers will create multiple program mixes encoded at different levels, like maybe 1080p versus 720p, to stream to different platforms simultaneously. So there's lots of ways of leveraging this multi-encoding and multitasking, that we can leverage on a Perl. Specifications, and this is going to answer one of the questions here about what codec is being used. So, quick summary of them: Perl Mini can capture up to full HD. Perl 2 could capture up to 4K when equipped. Perl Mini records to an SD card. Perl 2 records to the 500 gig SSD. Both can stream to individual connections over the local area network. Both can do multicasting on a local area network for maybe IPTV or digital signage needs. And then both can do multiple RTMP or RTMPS publishing to CDNs. Those could be basically any CDN that ingests RTMP. And we'll touch on that more on that in a second. Both Perls have APIs available, for both RS-232 serial as well as an HTTP-based API. And this allows you to integrate into larger systems. Both are supported with a Crestron driver that Crestron created to control through Crestron touch panels and other controllers. So for the larger environments where you might have other things being controlled by Crestron, a Perl can also be integrated within that. All video, both streaming and recording, is encoded using H.264 on the Perls, both Perls. So common codec, nothing crazy about that, nothing proprietary, most importantly. This means that those recorded files and the live streams are very easy to integrate into basically anything. It's a very common choice. In terms of someone asked the format as well. So the codec, as I mentioned, is always going to be H.264. The audio codecs can be MP3, AAC, or RAW PCM. In terms of the format of the files for recording, you can choose between AVI, MOV, MP4, and MPEG-TS. It doesn't change the codec choices, but it does change the container of those files. So those are things to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a couple more slides here. When we're talking about live streaming, we're usually talking about streaming to a CDN or a platform that's going to redistribute that stream. This is usually using RTMP or RTMPS. This is a short list of common platforms we see basically every day. And considering how many webinars we've been doing on Crowdcast, I should probably add Crowdcast to this slide. But essentially, any platform that can ingest RTMP or RTMPS, Perl can push a stream to them. So that could be your social media options like Facebook Live or YouTube Live, enterprise options like Wowza or IBM Cloud Video or Vimeo or any of those kind of things. These are all possibilities as long as they can ingest RTMP or RTMPS. We will have some more protocol options coming in the future. I don't really have anything specific to discuss there today, but we are going to be adding, later this year in a firmware update, we will be adding some additional protocols that are coming. The other options we have is integration through some of our partnerships. Some of these are through streaming, like Streamshark, or part of the AWS Media Services Compatibility Program. Wowza is also a streaming partner of ours. Some of them are other integrations, like the Crestron driver module, or for those of you working in the education sector or even the larger enterprise sector, you might be looking for a content management system. And so the Pearls can directly integrate with Kaltura or Panopto as content management systems. This gives us a ton of possibilities, especially for the education users, where all of your scheduling, all of the moving of assets can all be automated and scheduled in advance. And Perl essentially becomes a hands-off, self-controlled, like it just does it. Whatever Kaltura Panopto tells it to do, pulls the schedule down, streams, records, send the asset back to where it needs to be. Very easy, very simple. So there's a ton of ways you can do that as well if you're someone who's already using these content management systems. One of the other big strengths of the Pearls, and this is for both models, is the custom layout designer. This is where our mixing and switching begins. The layout designer, you can think of this a lot like scenes in applications like OBS or Wirecast. We call them layouts, but the idea is basically the same. You're creating these customized layouts that are made up of one or more inputs of video, images, audio, and so on. You can use cropping. You can choose the size and the positioning. In the case of Perl 2, you can enable chroma keying. You can use, like I say, images, including transparent PNG images, text overlays. There's a bunch of things here that you can play with and get really creative. And I'll show you exactly how that works when we get to the UI. Once we build a number of these different layouts, that's where the switching ability comes in on a Perl. So we're not literally switching the physical inputs the way you might see on a traditional broadcast mixer. We're switching these created layouts of whatever they might be. What it means, though, is that some of these layouts might be placeholders of just still images. Other ones might be a full screen video. Other ones might be exactly what you're seeing right now. This layout that you're seeing on the stream right now of me side by side with my slides and a little bit of background image for color, the cropping on my camera shot, all of that is being done through the layout designer on the Perl 2. This is a very basic example, but it's a great example of how easy it can be to set something up. And again, we'll get to that. Once we have these, we can then live switch between them. We can do that on the front touchscreen of the Perl. We can do it in the web browser user interface. We could do it through the local console if we have that enabled. We can do it through API commands. We can do it through the Crestron driver control as well. So there's a bunch of different ways to integrate your switching depending on the type of UI that you're looking for. One of those user interfaces is Epiphan Live. Epiphan Live is a secondary web browser-based interface that's more of an operator console. It's much more visual, shields a lot of the settings, and really focuses on the basics of start-stop, confidence monitoring, and switching. And I'll show you what that one looks like as well. This interface is particularly designed for a mobile browser, where the main administrator one will work in any browser, doesn't matter at all. You can choose whatever you want. There's no plugins or software to install. So any browser will work. We don't really have a preferred browser, to answer Alexa's question. The Epiphan Live interface is mobile browser friendly, but it'll work in any browser as well. And so I'll be using it in Chrome later, but it really doesn't matter. By its visual design, it's more touchscreen friendly as well. So many customers will use this with a tablet, iPad, smartphone in order to remotely control a Perl while they need the freedom of mobility to move around. All right. I'm going to jump away from my slides here at this point, but I just want to touch quickly on the fact that what we've created with the Pearls is an extremely flexible device. And because of that, we've seen it used in a huge number of ways. This is actually a very short list of some of the most common ways that we see the Pearls being used. live event production, which obviously today, right now, has changed a little bit from the normal, but is still a very important part. Education, this has been a huge part with the Pearls, especially with the Pearl Mini, of doing lecture capture or live events within an education context. Other things like healthcare, we've seen a big increase recently, and then corporate needs like meeting rooms, video production, legal environments like courtrooms, depositions, and then even security and control rooms. We've seen all of these very commonly with both models of the Pearl. So I'm going to stop my screen share here for a moment, and I'm going to switch over to our UI, and we'll start doing a little bit of a tour there. I will pause for questions before I jump into that, so don't worry about that. So let's see, what questions do we have here? Is cloud recording available? So we always record directly to the storage locally on the Pearl, but it's possible to upload those recordings to a network-based file server or even a cloud server, depending on which one you're using. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail when we go through the user interface. Let's see. Is it possible to do research by keywords or by slide on the Perl Mini recording? No. So basically, the slides are not slides to the Perl. They're just a video signal. It doesn't know the difference between a slide or whether it's a camera. It's just a video signal. It's just an HDMI signal. It doesn't contextually understand what the difference would be. So no, you couldn't search or look for specific things in the file that way. Let's see. Someone asking again, how are we running this current webinar using a Perl streaming to Crowdcast? Is the presenter using remote Zoom? Yes, Mike, that's basically exactly what we're doing. The Perl is streaming to Crowdcast. I'm being ingested over HDMI from a computer running a Zoom call with myself, my producer, and being hosted. So that's an important way. That's not normally something you would do. Obviously, if I was sitting in a physical studio, Zoom would not be a part of this at all. It wouldn't be necessary. Unfortunately, just due to the current global conditions around COVID-19, everyone working from home means we have to create this remote bridge between our multiple people involved. And so we're using Zoom for that, but bringing the video from Zoom into Perl, being creative with our cropping that and the layout designer that we have in Perl, and then streaming out to Crowdcast. Okay. All right, so this, we'll cut over here and we can take a look at the main administrator UI of the Perl 2. So coming back to what people were asking earlier, I am accessing this remotely through, and I'll actually zoom in a bit here on my UI so you guys can see it a bit better. I'm accessing this Perl 2 remotely. It is sitting in our office in a separate demo studio that normally I would do this kind of thing, sitting in that office, hosting a demo like this. And you'll see when I look at one of the camera shots, there's nothing in that room at the moment. But I'm using a service that we have called AV Studio. And what AV Studio allows us to do is pair a Perl to your AV Studio account, and from there, from the cloud, from the AV Studio cloud, remotely tunnel to this web UI and remotely control the Perl 2 as though you were local to it. It's very easy to do, very simple, and that's a tool that you can use currently for free through AV Studio. AV Studio has some other options which may help with the question about cloud recording, where you can actually upload recorded footage to AV Studio and do some basic editing of those files in the cloud. That's a paid service and something separate, but that's something you may want to look at as well. Check out avstudio.com. There's a ton of information there as well. In terms of the main UI, this is the main administrator UI. It's where you're going to get a quick summary of what's happening on the device. You're going to see obviously firmware versions. You're going to look at how many encoding channels you currently have. I currently only have two running, but this is a Perl 2. I could have as many as six, but for today, I only have the two. Down the left-hand side is basically all the different configuration pages. So I usually like to start the walkthrough of here from the bottom and going up. First page is the info page, which we were just looking at. The next one's firmware upgrade, pretty self-explanatory. This is also where you would add a 4K add-on to a Perl 2. Firmware upgrades generally are available free of charge as we release them for the life of the product, as long as we're still building firmware. Sometimes this is just maintenance and bug fixes. Sometimes it's feature upgrades. So definitely something you may want to consider. Just as an example, 2 years ago, Pearls didn't have the option of doing the direct CMS integration with Kaltura and Panopto. That was enabled in a firmware update. So customers who were using that maybe had their own strange workarounds with middleware and all kinds of things to make it work with their CMS. After that update, we're able to do a direct integration. So always keep an eye out as a Perl owner on firmware updates that we release periodically. We try to do a few every year, 2, 3 a year that have pretty major things in them. There's some other things here. There's maintenance menus for all kind of basic thing, including creating configuration presets. These are essentially system profiles that you can load, download as backups if you need to reinstall your config, basically. So there's lots of ways to leverage this to shift Perl's job from one thing to another. There's a media library where we upload images that we can use within our layouts. And some of these others are fairly basic. There's a serial port control. It just tells you what the specs you need for the serial port. There's a section here for the touchscreen where you can turn it off. You can limit what you're allowed to do. You can lock it out with a PIN code. It's very basic and straightforward in terms of controlling that front touchscreen. Another one that can be very important, though, is security, especially for our enterprise customers. Security is obviously important for everyone's networks, and some people have specific mandates that require certain security measures. At a basic level, Perl obviously needs a password to log into it. If we need to expand that beyond maybe 1 or 2 people that share a password, we might enable LDAP, which is integration to your domain. So with the domain integration, it means someone can log in using their domain credentials and be placed into, based on the group domain policy you create, into the 3 different account levels that Perl has: administrator, operator, and viewer. Administrator is obviously everything. Operator has limited controls, can't really change deeper settings, and viewers can just view streams, basically, and that's pretty much it. We have recently added some tunable operator level privileges. So within the operator level account, you can enable some additional pieces if they need it. Maybe network configuration because they're going on site and they need to change whether it's DHCP or static IP address, for example. So that's been recently added in a firmware update. Another security thing we run into quite often with enterprise customers is anything that uses a web-based UI like Perl does. They have mandates oftentimes that require they use HTTPS. You can enable HTTPS on a Perl 2. You can even use your own security certificates or other security certificates that you want. So there's some built in, of course, but if you have your own specific security certificates you want to use for HTTPS, you can load those, private keys and so on, to help control the security level. One of the next sections here is time and date. That's pretty self-explanatory. It sets the time and date. That's about it. Network settings, for the most part, are fairly self-explanatory. DHCP or static IP addresses, whatever you need. You can even set these from the front touchscreen if you need to, especially in out-of-the-box experiences. So if it's default DHCP, but if you need it to be static IPs out of the box, you can do that from the front touchscreen. Once you do that, then you can access the full web UI. Another note on security, one thing we see quite often in larger enterprises is the requirement for using 802.1x hardware-based network authentication. What this means is a port-based authentication layer that is pretty high level. Not everyone's using it yet, but we are starting to see it more and more, especially in the larger enterprises. What it means is that if you can't authenticate over 802.1x, you can't gain access to the network, period. And so Perl does support 802.1x. And again, like HTTPS, you can load your own certificates, private keys, login credentials, whatever you might need, depending on your implementation of 802.1x. There are not a lot of AV devices or encoders or video products on the market that have this level of enterprise security because it's not really an AV thing. But Perl's intended to not just be an AV toolkit, but also to be an IT toolkit. And so we've made sure to build in these advanced security features so that customers of all levels can use it and to feel comfortable and protected using it from a security standpoint. I'm going to take a look at some of the questions here quickly. Let's see here. One question, how reliable is this device? Does it have a built-in backup or it need to run two devices to secure our event? Perl is extremely reliable. In terms of backup, it doesn't have its own failovers. It is a single device. Some customers will buy the rack mount twin, which is, again, as I mentioned off the top, two different Perl 2s in the same chassis. They're independent of each other. Some people have chosen to go that route as having a hot standby or a failover that's configured, exactly the same way. They split all their inputs into both units, and if one goes down, they can spin the other one up right away. But that's not automatic. So if you are worried about that and you want to have failover or duplication, yes, it would mean having multiple Perl devices. Question here from Michael Dillon saying, what are the CPU limitations of each Perl? Will there ever be an easily accessible warning icon for when the frames are being dropped on the stream or recording? Well, in fact, it kind of is already there, Michael. So the CPU limitations are hard to quantify because there's a ton of variables to that. Our recommendations for the number of encoding channels that we talked about earlier, like 2, maybe 3 for Perl Mini or up to 6 for Perl 2, that's basically an indicator of system load. You can actually go above that. There's nothing to stop you from creating 10 channels on a Perl 2, but depending on what else you're doing, you might be pushing the CPU too far and you might start dropping frames. The best place to get an indicator is on this main information page, which is the first page that you log into. There's 2 indicators here. There is a system load one, but that might not be that accurate all the time, depending on the variation of configuration you have. What will be an indicator is the frame rate readout for your encoded channels. You see here, it says 30 and 30. This is the frame rate you have set in the channel, 30 in this case, and the actual frame rate being achieved, 30. I'm not running into any performance issues. But if I started running at an extremely high load, this actual number would indicate that we're dropping frames. I might see it 29, 28, 27. I've seen some customer configs where they have 8 channels all set to 30 or more, and none of them are achieving more than 20 FPS because they're way over the limit of what the CPU can handle. That's your primary indicator. Your first warning sign is if you start seeing dropping frames here. So I hope that answers that question, Michael. Will this video be available later elsewhere? Yes, it will be on our YouTube channel. Right, and then a couple of those. Michael is also asking, for people who get locked out for whatever reason, there's also a persistent static IP address. That is correct. You don't see it here in the UI, but in our user guide, there is a section, the manual for the Perl, there is a section talking about the direct connection rescue address. It's a hard-coded address that always exists, you cannot change, and is designed around a subnet mask that allows for 2 hosts, the Perl and your computer, so that you can directly connect to the Perl point to point with an Ethernet cable and still access it if you don't have DHCP or someone set a static IP address and you don't know what it is and they turn the touch screen off. As a last ditch, you can always use that direct connection method as well. So the user guide has all that detail. The user guide has a ton of detail. It's 500 pages of glorious information. So please definitely check it out. There's an online searchable version. There's also a PDF version. Aldo is asking, is in the Perl, since we were touching on network just before, I'll answer this one right now. Is there a way to see the speed of our internet connection? No, not currently. That's actually something we're hoping to add in the future as a feature, but we don't currently have it. And that's a way of measuring the connectivity and some level of speed detection or at least stability. But currently, no. If you're on a computer that's on the same network, you can obviously run a speed test from there and know what it is. That's the easiest way. Okay, so back to the menus. So we touched on network. The next few sections are some fairly basic ones. UPnP, if we want to use that as a local streaming option, maybe to pull up a stream on a smart TV or a set-top box, that's definitely an option. You give it a server name, you enable it. That's pretty much it. The next portion that's important is external USB drive behavior. So one of the biggest questions that we get all the time is, can I record directly to external USB? I'm actually surprised no one's asked it yet. The answer is no. That's somewhat intentionally limited because we cannot know the reliability of that external drive. If you plug in a really old, really slow USB 2.0 drive and try to record directly to it with a 4K high bitrate thing on Perl 2, and the drive can't keep up, and your recording fails as a result, that's not a good situation. And that is very likely to happen with the low-quality thumb drives that all of us own. The best way to make sure to eliminate that possibility is to just not allow it. It also is much more difficult to support all of the different format types for recording. So we don't record directly to USB. We record to the internal storage first, and then we can use some movement options, whether that's move copy on insertion, manually selecting files to move, or using the next section, which I actually have to disable my Kaltura integration first, is the automatic file upload rules. So someone asked earlier about clouds. This is one of the tools that we would use to do a cloud-based integration. We can enable the automatic file upload rules and point it to an FTP server, rsync server, CIFS, Samba, Windows Share, SCP, SFTP, Amazon S3, WebDAV, or an external USB drive. What happens with these is we can choose how often we'll move files from the internal storage to that external. On rotation means that as soon as a file finishes recording, it's immediately put in the queue and sent to that external device. And there's some other sub options here that we can leverage. But what it means is that if we choose external USB on rotation, when we apply this setting, it means that as soon as files finish, they're going to immediately be pushed to our external USB as a backup, or just so that at the end of the day, we can unplug that drive and walk away with it. So this can be a great tool, and many, many, many of our customers use it. They may optionally use something like SFTP or FTP and go to their NAS. There's a lot of possibilities that you can use to leverage with the automatic file upload. The other possibility that we touched on earlier was using the content management system integration. Something like Kaltura, for example. You could have all of this stuff, register it with Kaltura. It would pull down a schedule and automatically do all of this content management as the platform is designed to do. So that can be extremely powerful as well. Kaltura and Panopto are both supported there. Okay, so the next part is really all about video inputs and outputs. And we are getting to your other question there, Aldo, about JPEG for the background image. If you're talking about my background image on my camera of my engineering display, no, I can't give you that. But the nice blue-gray background that we have on the webinar, I'm sure we could make that available. The output ports, as I mentioned earlier on Perl, Perl 2 has 2 of them, Perl Mini has 1 of them. They can be assigned. They can be assigned your encoding channel, they can be assigned an input port like a loop through, or they can be the local console, as I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of options we can use here. If we use one of our encoding channels, it means all the mixing and switching would be reflected there. If we use an input port, then it would be a loop through essentially. So there's different options that we can leverage here. We can enable audio as well if we want, or we can flip it and mirror it if we need it to be a confidence monitor for on-screen talent. So there's lots of things. We can display an audio meter if we want. There's lots of little things we can play around with here. Again, on Perl 2, with the 2 different outputs, they can be assigned different tasks. They can be doing different things. So that's something to look at as well. From an input perspective, all of the audio and video inputs are listed here. We have our HDMI inputs. Now, in this demo system setup, one of these is connected to my desktop share, which it looks like rebooted itself at some point in the past few days because now it's just sitting at its idle desktop. But I'll get a readout of the resolution that's coming in over that port, as well as I can get a snapshot preview of what's coming in. And I can maybe enable deinterlacing if it's an interlace signal. If for some customizable reason I need to load an EDID, I can do that as well, or restore the factory one. My second HDMI input is coming from a camera that's sitting in that studio space. So you can see on that camera, I have my Perl 2 that I'm remotely controlling right now, and my Perl Mini sitting next to it in a very empty and lonely and dark studio in our offices. The other thing that we can do with an input is, let's say nothing is connected or someone unplugs something, is instead of getting this default, fairly boring, but pretty literal no signal image, is I can actually load a custom no signal picture. So I could load something that's colorful. I could upload my own logo, any JPEG or PNG image, basically. And when I use that, it means that instead of getting this fairly boring no signal, I would be viewing a custom no signal picture instead. So this can be a big advantage and very useful for a variety of reasons. Many customers enjoy this feature as a function of branding in the worst case scenario of someone pulling out a cable. Each input port could have a different no signal picture loaded to it. So you could even label them with which port it is to try and increase your troubleshooting speed if you needed to. The SDI ports, very similar, same kind of idea. They're all there. USB ports, I don't have anything plugged into this device, but again, UVC-based devices, UAC-based audio devices like a webcam, you plug it in, it's automatic detection, choose the resolution we want to pull from the camera. We can make adjustments if we need. We can still do the no signal picture if we want. We can pull audio from that device if we want, and everything is listed there. The other audio inputs, each and every audio input, whether it's embedded HDMI, embedded SDI, or analog, all of them will show a visual meter. Of course, there's no noise in that office right now, so there's nothing really to show there. But we would have a visual meter. And we also have a delay setting that if we're having some audio and video sync issues between those, we can make some adjustments from minus to plus 300 milliseconds to fine tune for any sync issues between our audio and video inputs. And if we have multiple audio inputs and for some reason each of their syncs are slightly different, each one has its own delay setting. So I'm actually going to look at the one that should be coming from my camera. But yeah, it's not even showing any levels there anyways. Again, the analog audio has that as well. It does have some gain adjustments, but again, it is line level, so the headroom is limited. But there is some gain adjustment there as well on the analog inputs. Here is where we would also choose whether or not to use those XLR inputs as a stereo pair or as separate mono inputs. The bulk of the work that you would end up doing on a Perl day to day is going to be within your channels, your encoders, essentially. So I have these two built here. The first one is a demonstration mixed and switched. When I click on that channel, it opens up a sub menu of different things. The status menu is going to give me a summary with a basic snapshot of what's currently happening there, a breakdown of the codec and the settings we're using, and some URLs that we can use to directly connect to this Perl to view that live stream on the local area network. I could use this clickable one and it would open another tab and basically show it in an embedded HTML5 player in my browser. I could use the MPEG-TS stream or the RTSP stream to go into a media player like VLC, or maybe the RTSP stream to ingest it into an NVR or security-based recording system on the network as well, like an IP camera. So there's a few options there. We can enable some of the other sub options like HTTP live streaming, which would allow people using an iOS device like an iPad or an iPhone directly in on the same network to view Perl natively. We can enable UPnP here as well if we want to share it that way. We can set some password access control if we want to lock it down. But most importantly in the streaming, and the most common use case we see, is RTMP and RTMPS push. This is very straightforward. We add one of these, we give it a URL. Let's say it's YouTube, for example. We put in our stream key, we hit apply, and we can hit start. One of the big advantages with Perl, of course, is that I can actually create multiple RTMP instances at the same time. So maybe one's YouTube and this one's Vimeo. Maybe I want to create another one that's going to be Facebook. And Facebook uses RTMPS now, by the way, so you can see that URL is slightly different. Essentially, I can create as many of these RTMP push instances as I want, provided I have enough bandwidth to support it. So if I'm streaming at 5 megabit and I create 3 of these, that's now 15 megabit going out. So I want some overhead on top of that. But in addition to RTMP and RTMP push, I can also enable my multicasting if I want. I can also enable my NDI output here if I want. All of these can coexist simultaneously on a Perl, provided the network will support it and not fall down. So this gives us a lot of, again, multifunction, multitasking possibilities. The other thing that we can do is, of course, the recording. We talked about that earlier, where we can choose between the different file types: AVI, MPEG-TS, MOV, MP4, and MP4 fragmented. One thing to keep in mind is some container types like MOV and MP4 are not really fault tolerant. They're not designed that way, where AVI and MP4 fragmented are. So if you're in a mission critical environment where you're concerned about maybe the power going down in the middle of the event, make sure you're choosing one of the fault tolerant file types so that you don't lose any data. We can start and stop recording here. We can give it file name prefixes. We can rename files. We can play files in a browser. We can download them, delete them, all kinds of different things. Another important setting here, of course, is our time and file size limits. This allows us to break these files into chunks. This can make them more manageable, more often uploaded if we're doing the automatic file upload. But usually it's about manageability. Having one giant file is not always ideal. So, we might want to break it up into pieces. We can set a time, or we can set a file size, and basically it operates on whichever comes first. It'll trigger based on whichever one comes first. If it hits one of these, Perl does not stop recording. Perl will continue to record, finish that file, and immediately start a new file with no gap in between. So even though you're breaking it into chunks, let's just say you wanted to make it 1 gig chunks so that things are just rolling through. You can set that, and every time it hits 1 gig, it'll just start a new file. And even if you record for 10 hours, you'll end up with however many files it takes in 1 gig pieces over that 10 hours. So that can be a pretty important thing to look at. Last but not least, we definitely want to look at our layouts and the layout designer. So I don't have anything too fancy set up here, but I'll look at some basic core elements. In my first layout here, what I'm using is basically just to play around with it in various different demos we've done. I have a background image, which is just a JPEG image, has some nice color to it, has a company logo. I'm using that as a background image, and I have my video inputs overlaid on top. I'm using the same camera input 3 times just for illustrative purposes, but I'm actually going to remove a couple of them just to clean it up a bit. Basically, all of the layout design is a click and drag interface. It's very easy to use. Anyone can do it. No reason to be scared of it or worry about it. Creativity is really up to you. Same thing with my other input here, which is my desktop share. Could be slides, could be whatever's being displayed on that computer, maybe another camera. It's all click and drag for me to choose where I want to fit them together, just like you're seeing in the webinar today of this side by side. I can enable chroma keying on, since I'm on a Perl 2. I don't have a green screen to demonstrate that with, but you know, we can play around with chroma keying. You can see some adjustment there. You know, and that can be a big advantage. We can also play around with cropping. And I actually am cropping this camera shot at the moment. When I click the crop button, I'm brought into an interface where, again, click and drag to choose where I want to crop down to. So maybe I don't need a frame that's quite that big or quite that tall. I can crop it down. If I have multiple things overlaid on top of each other, the layering is logical. All I have to do is drag my layers around in the menu here to choose what's the top and what's the bottom. It's very easy to do. I can choose my audio inputs, one or more, depending on whatever I need. It's very simple, very quick and easy to do. I could then look at building multiple layouts. So my other layout here is just my camera by itself. That's it. You know, audio input, that's all. With these 2 layouts, I can switch between them just by clicking on the radio button here or in the other interfaces we talked about, which I'll show you in a moment. My other channel here is completely independent. It has one layout of just my other input source by itself. It has no streaming. It has different recording settings. It has different encoding settings. It's doing its own thing completely. So we can, again, coming back to it, this is the multitasking ability of Perl. But speaking of encoding, I'll come back to my first channel for a moment. The encoding settings on Perl are pretty straightforward. How many crops? Sorry, just popping up here from Frank, question. And since we were just looking at the layout designer, I'll answer it now. How many crops can you make from one camera? As many as you want, Frank. There's no limitation there. You can reuse the same input many times and crop it many times. It's totally up to you. In the encoding settings, they're powerful, but they're designed to be straightforward. So H.264 is our video codec. Generally, that's done as in hardware. We can change that to software if we need a compatibility reason for some need. We can set our frame size. This is where we could maybe scale up or down if we wanted to. If we're doing any mixing and switching, we want to make sure that this option for the automatic frame size is unchecked. We can set our keyframe interval. We can set a frame rate, bit rate. These settings that I have here right now are actually pretty typical for a YouTube stream. We might have full HD, 2-second keyframe interval, 30 FPS, 6 megabit, and then our audio usually would be AAC 44 to 128K. Very simple and straightforward. And especially within live streaming, the platform you're using is generally going to have recommendations on what they want you to use. And so looking at those recommendations and then setting the Perl to reflect it is really all you need to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a channel here from scratch. And please throw more questions into the chat here as we go through. But what I'm going to do is build a third channel from scratch. And what I'm going to do is show you a method of re-encoding the same content at a different encoding level for maybe a different platform. So let's say my first one, that's my YouTube channel. I now want to stream to Facebook at 720. So what I'm going to do here is I only need one layout. I'm going to add a new item. It's going to be a video source. And in the video source drop-down box, it's actually going to show me my other encoding channels. So I'm going to select my first program channel. I'm going to select the audio from that same channel, and I'm going to save this. In the encoding settings, I can then set a specific frame size of 720p. Facebook prefers a 2-second keyframe interval at 30 frames per second, and they usually recommend something, in and around the 2 to 4 megabit range for 720p. So I'm going to choose 2500. They prefer an audio setting, much like YouTube does, AAC at 44 at 128K for the bit rate on the audio. I would save this. I would then go over to my stream, create an RTMP push, and then I might put in my Facebook server URL. I'm not actually putting a stream key here and actually starting it. It's just for demonstration purposes. Save that. And now, whatever I do in my first channel will be reflected in this one, but I'm re-encoding it at 720p. So it's the same content, same mixing and switching, same audio would all be done. But instead of recording or streaming it or recording it at 1080 like I am in the first one, I can now stream it a second time at 720 to a different platform. So it's very simple and easy to do. So let's see. The other interface I want to look at is Epiphan Live. So we talked about that earlier. It's a different dashboard, operator-oriented dashboard. And essentially, when I open that up, again, it'll work in any web browser. I get a more visual interface. So I can have some previews here showing what's happening with different channels. And again, I can assign these thumbnails to be different channels or different inputs. I can stop recording here. I can, in my multiple channels, I could stop streaming if I had somewhere to go. I can look at which inputs are connected. I can see where things are running. I can look at audio, but I can't really change anything. I can't manipulate the channel settings. I can't build new layouts, but I can do stop control, and I can do switching control. So again, if I open the switcher, one of my channels had multiple layouts, and I have visual thumbnails. And this is very much what the front touchscreen shows as well. I have thumbnails of those different layouts, and I can switch to those back and forth as I need. If I made more layouts, all those thumbnails would be reflected down here, and I could choose from them and do my live switching that way. So that's something that can be it's much more visual. Again, you're going to get an actual visual element to the switching here. You would see things moving if there was anything to see. Of course, I'm not on that camera, unfortunately. So this can be a great tool. And again, this will work on your iPad or your smartphone or whatever you want to use. You can also access recordings here if you want. And if you need to get back to the admin panel, you can do so. So again, this is a fantastic tool that allows you to do some of those basic functions. So I'm going to dive back over here into questions. So the first question here is, are there some training available for Perl? Well, of course, the online user guide is there for your reference at any time. There's a fully searchable one. There's a downloadable PDF. We also have a playlist on our YouTube channel of Epiphan U, which is essentially short 2 to 4 minute how-to videos. And there are quite a number of those on a lot of Perl functions. In terms of training beyond those resources, if you have questions, you can always email us, get on live chat with our support team, and we can address specific questions. In some cases, we can arrange for one-on-one training as well, depending on your needs and scheduling. Another question there, how do we get 1080 to Facebook? Unfortunately, Kevin, Facebook has not opened 1080p to all accounts or all encoders yet. It's something they are rolling out over time, but it hasn't been enabled for everybody yet. So not everyone can. You can stream to 1080 in 1080 to Facebook from a Pearl, but the playback on the viewer side may only be 720p. So that's just something to keep in mind. Eventually, I'm sure they will open it up for everyone, but at the moment, it's somewhat limited on who they allow what they call 1080p pass through, no transcoding, just straight 1080. Let's see. Question here about Pearl Mini. We sometimes need to stream with the original sound channel and to stream the voice of the interpreter instead of the original sound. Is it possible to use one audio input for the original? Yes. So essentially, Andrew, this would be a modification of what I was just playing with creating the third channel. So in this third channel, instead of following, when I was building that layout where I'm using the exact same content video wise, instead of using the same audio feed, I would choose a different audio feed. So let's just say my interpreter input is on analog B. That's what I would set up here. So I'm getting the same visual, same mixing and switching that I'm doing in my main origin channel, but I'm bringing in audio from a different input only, so that the only audio they hear is the interpreter while seeing the exact same visual. So I do need to use two different encoding channels for this. Obviously, that's much easier to do on a Perl 2, depending on how many of those interpretations or interpreters you need. But definitely, you can do that on a Perl Mini with two encoded channels as well. I hope that answers that question. Let's see. Kevin following up here, stream to Facebook and YouTube. It appears the Facebook is limited to 720. Would it be best to use two channels with different encoding? Kevin, that's going to depend on which Perl you're using. With a Perl 2, where you have a lot higher headroom to have multiple channels, yeah, you could do two and it's fine. If it's a Perl Mini, where the headroom's a little more limited on the number of encoding channels you have, I would minimize the number of channels you have at all times by probably only doing one. Again, you can send 1080 to Facebook. They're just going to scale it and transcode it down to 720 for your viewers. So the only thing it's costing you there is the extra bandwidth potentially of streaming, 1080 twice instead of 1080 once and 720 once. But if you have the bandwidth, it's no real risk. Okay, I see you say there in chat, Kevin, it's a Perl Mini. Yeah, so I would probably stick with just one encoding channel for both Facebook and YouTube at the same time at 1080 and do it that way. Let's see. For networks that won't allow devices to pull the firmware directly, will you supply files independently? Jason asking that. Yes, Jason, we can. Just need to email our support team. You can just email info@epiphan.com or support@epiphan.com. Please include the serial number of your device when you reach out to us, and we can provide a firmware version that you can do as an offline update if you need. Further to Mike's question regarding Zoom, is that the production computer directly fed into Perl, or are you seeing the feed to the Perl in your office somehow? Yes, so there's a computer sitting next to the Perl in the office that's participating in a Zoom call with me. It's HDMI out from that computer running the Zoom call into Perl, and then to basically make all of the ugly Zoom UI invisible, we're using Perl and the layout designer, as we've been playing with here, to crop down what's being shown in Zoom to give us that side-by-side picture-in-picture type effect. So it's to Perl, it's just an HDMI input, but the origin of it is a Zoom call that's actually coming in. I hope that answers that question. Let's see. See in chat there, Frank saying Perl 2 is a big investment. When will Perl 3 be for sale? There's currently no plan on the drawing board for a Perl 3. A Perl 3 would definitely not be less of an investment than a Perl 2 because it would indicate that it's a newer, better version of Perl 2. There may be a Perl 3 in the future, but it's not currently on the drawing board. Perl 2 is still honestly more than most people need in many cases, and is doing extremely well and serving many of our customers extremely well. So we're not currently looking at changing that. All right. So I think, unless there's any other questions, please throw them into chat there. We've gone a little over our hour that we anticipated. So I hope you all learned something. I hope many of you understand Perl a little bit better than you did before. Of course, any questions you have ongoing or any help that you need with Perl, Perl 2, Perl Mini, please reach out to myself and our support team, info@epiphan.com, support@epiphan.com, live chat on our website. Any of those things, we're happy to help and answer any of the questions you have. As already mentioned, we have the online user guide that's fully searchable. There's a ton of information in there, but everything you could ever want to know about a Perl is in there. As well as we do have that series of videos on our YouTube channel showing a lot of how-tos. We also have a lot of different webinars coming up, and we also always do our weekly Live at Epiphan show every Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, where we're always covering some different subjects of all kinds of different things. I believe this week we're going to be talking about more and more relevant things to the situation we all find ourselves in with, how to do things remotely, how to live stream events and stuff. So we have the live show on Thursday. We have another webinar tomorrow all about live event streaming, I believe. So come back for that one. If you haven't already registered for it, check that one out. Should be on the same webinar registration page you found this one. Let's see. Kevin's just throwing in there, can I access Perl Mini via Epiphan Live with an iPad remotely? Yes, both Perl 2 and Perl Mini both have Epiphan Live. Functions exactly the same way. It's mobile browser friendly, an iPad, smartphone, anything will do. As long as you're on the same network, no problem. If you're trying to do it remotely, then you would be using AV Studio. It would still be possible to do, but Epiphan Live uses way more bandwidth than the admin one is. So depending on the strength of your connection, it might be a little laggier for Epiphan Live than the admin through AV Studio, but it's definitely still possible. So if you haven't experimented with AV Studio, go to avstudio.com. You can create an account for free. You can pair your Perl to your AV Studio account once you've done that, and then you can remotely access your Perls from the cloud. Fabio throwing the one in there. Is it possible to feed content with alpha channel enabled? That's a great question. With NDI, yes. So if you wanted to add an NDI source, we do support alpha over NDI. In fact, during this webinar, you've been seeing some titles coming and going. Cameron, maybe we can throw one up as another example. That is being done over NDI using alpha channel. So that title you see there, that's being done NDI alpha channel from New Blue Titler Live. So just using titling software that does the same, you can do that. All right, I am starting to get a tired voice, so I'm going to wrap this up here. Michael asking one more. We had issues, a video with embedded audio not keeping sync with Perl recordings after being played back. I mean, Michael, sometimes that can be the player. If it was synced in the live stream when Perl was getting it, then it was encoded in sync, and it could be a player or an editor that's breaking the sync after the fact. If it is a player or an editor that's breaking the sync after the fact, there's not anything Perl can do about that, unfortunately. So if you want to email us about that, we can help dive in a little deeper with you. But that's kind of, it depends on what's actually causing the sync break. Like I say, some players, some editors break it in the post-production phase. Which method we're using to generate that NDI feed? We were using New Blue Titler. New Blue Titler sends the NDI feed from a computer running New Blue Titler into the Perl 2, and it's generating all those titles. And the graphic you saw off the top with the countdown timer, all that was being done in New Blue Titler over NDI with Alpha Channel into the Perl 2. Great. So I think that'll do it for today, everyone. We're 20 minutes over time. So once again, thank you everyone for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you, like I said, once again, learned something. Yeah. David, can you explain a little more about the delay in the audio? What do you mean by that? If you mean changing delay in audio, each audio input on a Perl has a delay setting. This delay setting, you can go from minus 300 milliseconds or to plus 300 milliseconds or anything in between. So where you might need this is if your camera input and your audio input essentially arrive at Perl at different times, so they're out of sync, you can correct for this by plus minus adjusting the audio to correct. So that's one thing to look at. We've seen this even with embedded audio coming from cameras where they might be 90 milliseconds off over the embedded HDMI feed. You have to test it. There's a ton of videos on YouTube about how to do sync testing. We even have our own on our own YouTube channel somewhere. But basically, you can do a sync test. It's a little beep test to show you, and then you can make those corrections as you need to. Okay, I'm not going to take any more questions. We need to wrap this up. So if you do have any more additional questions about Perl Mini, Perl 2, or any of those things, feel free to email or jump on live chat on our website. We're happy to help you. But for today and for this webinar, that's going to do it. So once again, thank you so much. And we will see you in the next one, which is tomorrow. So check that out when you can. That's it. Thanks to my moderators. Thanks to the producer, man. And see you later.